We obviously have come to the end of the session and want to take some time to walk through what we're thinking and also take your questions. But I think there's something very clear as we sit here today. The legislature that just adjourned did not represent Tennessee, and sadly didn't even try. If you walk outside and talk to people in any corner of this state, Tennesseans are worried about the pandemic, the recession, their health care, their kids' schools, their parents in nursing homes, and the justice, if you will, of our justice system. Instead, they got a governor and legislature who just couldn't summon the strength to lead. Rather than step up to the challenges of this moment, Republicans fell back into the old habit of divisive politics that Tennesseans are sick of. And it is mind-bogglingly out of touch that the legislature's priorities in a time of pandemic and recession were this radical abortion legislation and defending a statue of the first leader of the Ku Klux Klan. So, and it's worth remembering that this is what they actually had time to think and plan on, right? We adjourned in March for almost, 2 months and had weeks to prepare to deal with all of the challenges that the state's facing, all of the problems with our unemployment system, with the growing number of uninsured. And instead, we got the mess that we saw last week. And so the legislature has adjourned, but it certainly hasn't finished the business of Tennessee. People should be able to expect more from their state government than the leaderless, divisive mess that we saw last week. I think it's just that simple. And so we're going to start today by talking about some of the unfinished business where the state really needs leaders to step up to the plate and do their job. And then we'll look forward to taking your questions. I'm going to turn over first to my colleague from Nashville, Representative Harold Love.
Thank you so much, Senator Yarbro. I think you touched on something that's very important that we could have worked on this second half of our session, particularly when you think about the fact that George Floyd's death had worldwide implications, where you saw persons from all parts of the world lifting their voices to elicit a change in the way that Black lives are viewed. And we have a situation here in Tennessee where, coming back in for our completion of our session, we could have enacted certainly so many things that would have also echoed those same sentiments. People across the world, not just the city of Nashville, not just the state of Tennessee, not just the United States, but all over the world were, again, lifting their voices to declare that Black lives do indeed matter. And I think it was a missed opportunity for the legislature not to consider legislation that would have put us on the track to talk about how we could de-escalate force, to talk about how we could have implicit bias training, to talk about how we could be more proactive in the ways that we address racial injustice in the state of Tennessee. And certainly a huge missed opportunity, I think, was, again, not addressing the issue of the Nathan Bedford Forrest bust on the second floor of the Capitol. I myself was in a committee where 3 legislators tried to bring a resolution to it, tried to bring some closure to it, and at each turn, the opportunities were missed. And so for me, it's very concerning because you can only kick this ball down the street so much. You can't keep punting on this issue. And we talked about the Capitol Commission need to step up. We've also need to make note that the governor needs to make a decision about how many more conversations does he need to have? How many more people need to tell him their story about how the Nathan Bedford Forrest bus negatively impacts him on a daily basis? If you can get a number, if he needs 10 more people, I will find 10 more people. If he needs 100 more people, we'll find 100 more people. And so those were missed opportunities. And I think we saw the culmination of the frustration of many of our Black elected officials when the House, chose to even not memorialize a young lady who was tragically killed in Nashville. And that was just one of the more frustrating parts of our legislative session. So I think that all those events, from the missed opportunities to talk about how we could de-escalate force, how we could have more training, opportunities to visit how we even support those who are trying to protest and lift their voice. There's no good thing that will come out of having a piece of legislation that would criminalize those who are trying to protest and lift their voices. Because the truth be told, I think there were protesters out on the streets about a month ago protesting, wanting to have the state reopen. And I didn't see troopers out there dealing with those particular persons. So I just want to bring home the point that we had a chance to address racial and social justice in this state. And I wish we had really taken some time out and stepped up to address those issues, because they're not going away. And I think that's evident by the fact that you are still having tension and unrest across this country.
Hey guys, listen, this is Raumesh Akbari. I am, happy to be here with everyone, certainly after the tumultuous end to our legislative session last week. I think that so many things were done in the dark that obviously had to come to light. But the topic that I'd kind of like to talk to you about, and it's something that we've been working on since the very beginning of the legislative session, and that has to do with education. This year, we know that our schools are facing probably the biggest struggles of our lifetime. They are not, they've had students who have been out of school for several months now. Besides dealing with the normal achievement gaps and summer learning loss, which occurs every year, they will actually have to catch their students up from the time that was missed during the COVID-19 crisis. And they also have to try and navigate what this will look like when the school year resumes. Will it be completely virtual? Will it be online? Will it be in person? Will it be a combination of that? So the final budget that we passed in March, or we approved in March, it cut education funding by $70 million, which was already pretty bad. It took away pay raises, 1.5% pay raise increase for our teachers. The problem with this budget that was passed out, and we tried to put forth a budget amendment that would have given an additional $150 million in funding to our school systems, because many of them are dealing with a lack of revenue from their local governments that will be provided to the school systems. So they're potentially having to fire. Several counties have already identified in Jackson and Wilson County and Knox County that they will have to furlough some of their teachers and teaching assistants. This is a time where we need our students to have the most amount of support, not the least amount. Many of my colleagues have said this before, but a budget is a moral document. And unfortunately, the priorities of this administration was made clear when they decided to cut education funding, cut our raises to our teachers, even though we know several other government entities did receive pay raises. And there was an opportunity to do it. We all know that we are facing potential, we faced budget shortfalls, but there was a configuration either taking from the reserves or rainy day funds or reallocation. And what we specifically wanted was the $150 million COVID relief fund that was approved in March to be reallocated for education directly to our school systems, because those funds were reimbursed by the federal government. The bottom line is this: our students deserve so much more. Our teachers deserve so much more. if we don't get this right, then we're really setting our kids up for failure, because they're already dealing with so many different circumstances, and education is going to be it's going to be the key to help us move forward beyond this crisis. So I'm going to turn it over now to House Democratic Caucus Chairman Mike Stewart.
Thank you very much, Senator. I'd like to focus a little bit on healthcare and both the Republicans' complete lack of focus on things that matter and their decision to focus on politics instead of people's actual health. You know, what we saw, the signature healthcare bill that was passed, if you can call it that, was not Medicaid expansion, a long overdue agenda item which Democrats have been pushing for years. It was not even a more comprehensive response to the COVID-19 crisis. You know, we saw this week, as the Commissioner of Health mentioned yesterday, the largest spike in COVID-19 cases that the state has witnessed. But the Republicans in the legislature during our session did not take steps to further respond to that crisis by putting more contact tracers in the field or taking any other steps that systematically addressed this significant threat to every senior in Tennessee, to every family in Tennessee, and to the overall workings of our economy and our efforts to continue to recover economically. So Republicans did not focus on the things that matter. What did they focus on? They focused on passing an unconstitutional anti-abortion bill, a bill that is the most aggressive, radical attack on women's reproductive rights as has been passed by any legislature in the United States, a bill that bans abortion in virtually all circumstances, a bill that imposes draconian criminal penalties on doctors. It would be hard to overstate just what an extraordinarily far-reaching act this bill was. And how was it passed? Was this something that was passed after lengthy debate, after a true process? Of course it wasn't. As everybody knows now, this abortion legislation was passed in the dead of night by a Senate that had stated publicly that it was not going to take up this issue. It was passed at a time when the Capitol was virtually closed to visitors. So there was essentially no process. And as far as we can tell, this abortion bill was a chit in an overall budget deal whereby the Senate Republicans received a certain number of budget concessions and the House Republicans got this draconian far-right abortion legislation passed. So there are so many things wrong with the House and Senate Republicans' priorities. It's almost hard to piece through it. You have the House and Senate Republicans ignoring entirely the incredibly focused and pressing needs of the state. The fact that we have hospitals closing, the fact that 1 in 10 Tennesseans has no insurance, the fact that all across the state we have people that are having trouble getting access to basic services, and the fact that we have a COVID-19 crisis that is anything but under control and threatens the healthcare and economic livelihood of every Tennessean. None of those important agenda items were taken up by the Republicans. Instead, they chose to reach back to their political, they chose to focus entirely on the tired political agenda that they've been pushing for years, attacking women's right to choose in a way that is patently unconstitutional, that will do nothing but require expenditures by the state in the lawsuits, and essentially will accomplish nothing. Unfortunately, it would be nice to say that on healthcare, the Republicans acted in a strange way or a way that was different from the way that they've approached other things. But as we're seeing today, from one end of the state to the other, we see nothing but unfinished business by the current Republican leadership. They essentially accomplish nothing of consequence that benefits Tennesseans. during this recent session. All they did really was push political agenda items. The unconstitutional far-right attack on women's reproductive rights is only the most egregious example of this. So unfortunately, we head into the next year with much work undone. We're still one of a very small handful of states, these outlier states, that still have not expanded Medicaid under President Obama's Affordable Care Act. It's a diminishing and an unfortunate club to be in. And we're a state where COVID-19 is completely not under control, where COVID-19 is rising, and where it presents a significant threat to everybody's efforts to open up the economy, to get people back to work, not to mention the extraordinary threat to the healthcare of Tennesseans across the country. Not a good report, but I believe it's an accurate report in terms of where things stand with respect to healthcare and the Republican majority in the legislature. With that, I'll turn it over to Leader Karen Camper.
Hey, good morning, everyone. And again, thank you all for being here this morning. This has certainly been one of the most unusual sessions we've had here in the General Assembly, to say the least. There is no way anyone could have predicted the challenges that we face, but I am proud of our caucus members and our fellow members who have gone above and beyond to work on behalf of the constituents during this exceedingly difficult time. Although there has been a great amount of focus on the past few weeks and the end of session, I think we need to first recognize the work that our people, the work of our people as this pandemic really began to take hold. If you remember, it was the Democratic members of the House and the Senate who made a concerted effort at the beginning of that to provide all the protections for our citizens. It was the Democratic caucuses in both the House and the Senate that was pushing for the governor and the legislature to close, get to the business, close, and deal with this pandemic. We passed the budget in March. Our members fought hard for healthcare protections. We fought for small business funding. We fought to protect our students. You know, we fought against the voucher legislation, and we did a lot of things that we thought were important for the citizens of this state. We proposed amendments that would make people, that would make sure that people saw us fighting for them, whose money that we were actually debating spending at that time. And we wanted to make sure that it was focused on the things that people needed and cared about. We fought to make sure that their voices were heard. During the recess, if you think about that, Democrats, we went straight to work on our constituents' concerns, because at that time, unemployment was a really big issue. The system wasn't responding. People weren't getting into the system. They was making changes and these kinds of things. But we kept pressuring this administration. And so it was our caucuses that pushed the administration to do all the things that needed to be done to, we in essence became caseworkers for our constituents, to help walk them through the process, get them, their access to the system, to get their unemployment checks. I'm also pleased that this voucher legislation that we had been fighting against for years had been postponed. And then the courts came out after that with a decision that we knew would be. And we knew that the program was unfair. And so we were pleased that we continued to fight for that, and that the courts agreed with us on that. But even after that, this administration still wanted to have that money in the budget. And it was the House and Senate Democrats that fought to get that out of the budget. And we had some success there. I don't know if you remember, in the budget we passed in March, there was funds in there for our counties, the biggest economic engines of this state. And during the last several weeks, there was a move to take that funding away. And so we fought to make sure it was put back in the budget. And although it was at a reduced amount, we did get that money back in the budget. I'm very proud of my caucus and the members of the Black Caucus for all of their efforts against the hate that went on, or this perceived hate that was bottled up in people with the George Floyd killing occurring as we came back from the recess. This was really a unique focus that we would not have had if members had been back in their districts. Tempers flared and emotions were high and were raw. But this is another situation that is not a recent creation. It exposed factions in our society. It exposed factions in social contact that's been here for decades, if not centuries. I hope that the turmoil that arose, that this session will lead to more dialogue. We cannot pretend anymore, and we cannot be silent on things that have divided this legislature for years, things that have divided our state and things that have divided our country.
I can hear you. Yeah.
Yes,
Go ahead.
Go ahead.
Yeah, hey, this is Andy. I was curious to y'all's reaction yesterday on what Lee had to say about, I mean, here you're getting, these hot spots and, increases in COVID. And at the same time, no sign of, action from the state. The state seems more concerned with, resumption of the economy and not any sort of return at this point to previous or some of the other restrictions.
I think it seems like we have a lot of people who are in denial about the reality that this pandemic is still very much with us and still very much a threat, not only to our health, but to our economy. And we've seen too much where the governor has been following the lead of the White House in sort of thinking that you have to only focus on the economy. I think or that you're choosing between the economy and healthcare. That's a false choice. And I think that if you look around the country, if you look around the world, you'll see that the places that have focused on addressing the health crisis are the ones who are having the economic success as well. And so I think that we need to continue to be focused. We need to be focused like a laser on this health issue. I think Chairman Stewart addressed some of the shortcomings that we've had on sort of the testing and tracing and isolation. But I think that we've had a false choice on this issue all along, and a little bit more clarity out of the governor about where our health priorities are and how we're going to achieve them, I think would go a long way. And probably we could be further along in the economic reopening than we even are.
There's an expression that says you have to go slow to go fast. I think that across the state, there was probably a move too quickly to ramp up to get back to normal. And until we have a viable treatment plan or vaccine, we just have to adjust to the fact that things are not normal. The fact that there's something so simple as wearing a mask that really could help protect so many people from continuing to get infected with COVID, and it's been politicized, should tell you kind of where we are and where this how the state is viewing things. The bottom line is this: cases are continuing to go up. Initially, a lot of them were nursing homes, assisted living facilities, but now we're talking about actual community clusters, and that's where things get really dangerous. As it starts to get even warmer and people want to engage in normal summertime activities, I think there's going to take a little bit more action, a little bit stronger rhetoric from those at the highest levels of government in this state to make sure that people take this seriously, because right now they've gotten comfortable and unfortunately cases are continuing to rise.
Okay, so over in Kentucky, we saw that at a number of polling places, they had been cut. So how can we ensure people will have the option to vote despite changes because of the coronavirus? Is there anything we can do at the legislative level?
We missed our chance.
Well, at the legislative level, you saw in March that they approved legislation to have larger consolidated voting centers instead of the traditional, neighborhood-based precincts. So I do think that that is a problem. However, fortunately, the courts have ruled in the favor of the people. And right now, they are allowing unrestricted, no excuse absentee ballot requests, which I think folks really need to take advantage of. But the situation in Kentucky is just absolutely insane that you are restricting someone's right to vote when they want to vote, when they're in line and they're being locked out. That's the opposite of what we need to do here. Certainly, I think it'll be up to the local folks at this point. The state obviously has overarching oversight.
And I would say with respect to that, we need to make sure that the state cooperates in the effort to implement the absentee voting plan that has been created by the courts. I mean, the courts have ruled that despite opposition from Republicans in the legislature, the courts have ruled that everybody in Tennessee should be able to vote by mail. And we would call upon the Secretary of State and his office to ensure that they are fully cooperative with local election commissions in making sure that this occurs swiftly and effectively without any sort of obstruction.
In regards to the Tennessee's heartbeat bill, it's one of the most strict on abortions in the United States. So now some have been challenged, and this one will be challenged by the courts. But how do we feel about that? Do we feel like the one that was passed is legal, or are we going to spend some money on lawyers, fighting this?
I'd like to address that. I mean, it's a completely unconstitutional piece of legislation. I don't think the sponsors care that it's unconstitutional. They wanted to pass it to score political points. And under our current law, I think there's no doubt that the courts will strike it down. The problem is until that happens, the law takes effect, and it has a tremendous chilling effect on people's constitutionally guaranteed right to control their own reproduction.
I also want to jump into that for a second because not only is this unconstitutional, the way this bill was passed was one, I think, of the low points in democracy in the state. This is a bill that we weren't even talking about, that was put on notice in the Senate after midnight, after the Senate had not just failed to publicize it, but actively told everyone that we would not be considering it. I think that's something that is, just a genuine abuse of what our role is supposed to be. And the fact that it happened as part of a budget negotiation and that women's rights were traded away like poker chips is just disgusting.
The governor so far has been talking about efforts to have racial reconciliation, conversations that he wants to engage in the coming weeks and months. I'm wondering, what sort of concrete things do you think need to be done at the legislature, whether it's through, bills or non, legislative related efforts to actually have, I guess, a productive conversation and action related to race in Tennessee. It seems like obviously there's always flare-ups of issues, but we saw things like the criminal justice bill sort of take a sideline, or the reform efforts that the governor had. And what would you like to see in the next couple of months and weeks?
Hey, Joel, this is Leader Camper. Thank you for that question. One of the things I think is important to happen in a reconciliation type of discussion is really an opportunity to tell our truth. So I be comfortable, and I'm getting feedback. I'm sorry guys, I'm getting feedback. I think people need to be comfortable in discussing the truth and people's mind being opened to hearing it and not be locked into a state of denial because you don't believe it's true. So in order for you to make the concrete decisions moving forward, it has to be what I call a truth-telling session. So if he's open to really listening and hearing from people on their life course in this country and in this state, in these cities, everything, every day that's impacting their life is real. And so if we're going to have a reconciliation, there has to be an opportunity for a table of truth to be told on both sides. That's where you can begin to understand what people are actually going through and experiencing in their life here in this state. Secondly, there are some things that can be done on a policy regulatory level that doesn't even require legislative intervention or legislative action. The governor right now could decide on his own, which we encouraged him to do in some of the things we've asked him for. He can decide that in order to give equitable access to state contracts, he can just do it. He can give equitable access to African-American banks in terms of deposits into those banks, who in turn will give loans to Black African-American businesses and people in this state. He can do that he can just do it. He could decide, he and the treasurer could decide, which I've had conversation with the treasurer about this, can decide that if we look at the brokerage firms where we deposit and allow them to manage our pension funds in an equitable way, allow African-American businesses to have access to managing those funds, we could do it. But there's a choice being made. We're choosing not to based on something in our own mind because we're not listening to a truth-telling session. So yeah, reconciliation is important. Reconciliation needs to happen. But if you're not willing to listen to the truth about it, then I'm not sure how far we can go. And I'll let somebody else opine, but these are things that I told the governor in an email, that you have an opportunity here to really make a difference, Governor. You can do it. You can make a decision all by yourself and empower citizens in this state who have been traditionally left out. If you look at the disparity study that took place in 2009, I was just getting here. It showed that with state contracting, less than 0.1% was going to African Americans. In the study, there was funds set aside to implement the recommendations out of the study to give some level of equity. That money is still in the treasurer's office, has not been done. So we can say we want to talk reconciliation, but do we want to talk reconciliation? So I'm gonna leave it at that and let somebody else opine. I know Love have some interesting comments he may want to make around this issue.
Thank you, Leader Camper. And I'm going to echo everything that Leader Camper said and just add this little bit to it. There's something spectacular and wonderful about the will of an executive. If an executive wills to do something, that executive sends that message to the legislature and also throughout the administration. For example, the executive in this state willed for an education savings account bill to be passed, and they got it done. So I would ask the question, what is it going to take to have this executive will to move the Nathan Bedford Forrest bus out the Capitol? What will it take to have him leverage his will to get that done? Also, what would it take to have this executive, as Theodore Campbell said, will to do these other things that will cause us to have this truth and reconciliation? Because as she said, you cannot have reconciliation without truth. And so I would just leave that there, that the executive has a lot of will if he wants to leverage that. And we've seen it done before. All we're asking now is that he do it again, except in this case, he specifically use it for the request of not just Black folks in the state, but Black elected officials who have had conversations with him time and time again about what our desired will is.
So definitely I'll add a little bit more. I think my colleagues did a great job covering it. But what I'd like to see, and I've shared this with some of my colleagues in the Senate, because a couple of them have kind of come to me and asked about, how are you doing? And, I want to understand more about this. I've talked to my children and they've said X, Y, Z, and I just want to understand. So what I'd like to see, similar to what we've done or initially tried to do by having an expert come in and explain or lead a training on sexual harassment, there are experts who do these types of reconciliation and healing conversations. We have to talk about implicit bias. When you saw Representative or Chairman Carter make the joke with Joe Towns, Representative Towns, about fried chicken and not even, aware that it was racially offensive. These types of conversations have to be had because there's no way that we can move forward. You saw the complete, you saw the tension and how high it was the last week of session. If we don't have this type of holistic conversation and training, I think we will not be able to have any sort of unity or change. I will also kind of echo the comments of my colleagues who talked about the governor really stepping up, have these conversations right now about moving the bus, about creating equity around contracting. This is the time. You have the power. We as African-American legislators are supporting you. We're supporting this. We're asking for this. Our constituents are demanding this. And so it's a matter of doing it at this point. There's already been an interest expressed by the governor to create or yield some sort of change. So at this point now we have to do it. Talking is enough talking. And lastly, I'll say this, and this kind of speaks to the demonstrators and those who have been protesting for some time. Sometimes you have to have conversations with people who do not agree with you in any way. You have to give them a seat at the table and listen to what they have to say. You represent them just like those who agree with you. Have these honest conversations. I think that's the only way that you can really say that you've been inclusive and have heard from the people. But something's got to give. It's not every year the Black Caucus has an agenda of legislation that we push forward that will help African Americans across this state, no matter whose district they're in. And every year, a couple of little pieces are cherry picked off of it. It's time to have a real conversation about the percentage of African Americans in this state that have been crying out for help.